Gentlemen or ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for taking this effort and coming to Poland, because I take your trip as a very clear sign of attempt to understand each other as well as we can. And my clear objective is also to outline to you the bill and what is it about, but also maybe to present this in the context. And the context in Poland is actually very different to this in Israel, but it shouldn't be so different. It is different because Israel, even if the state looks like being under pressure from the 6 Days War, Yom Kippur War, and throughout the last half century, your state is for a long time independent, strong, so fights for objective view on the recent history, and fights successfully for objective truth and absolute truth. And Poland, which the country which was sharing with you the atrocities of war 75, 80 years ago, is in a different position. We have actually regained our independence in 1989, and the independence was even, well, it was kind of full after 1993 when Red Army left our country, but the post-communist elite was a dominant power in Poland, and they didn't want actually to clarify, so to say, outstanding historical issues. And we are today in a very much turning point and very important point of our history, where after last number of years when we would have heard the phrases like Polish death camps, Polish concentration camps, there were so many, such a big part of the population was appalled, felt offended with those statements, that there was a growing pressure on us. And by the way, I didn't need this pressure. I felt myself that lots has to be done in this area, in this field. So a lot of pressure on politicians to do something with this. And this is why almost 2 years ago there was this first draft of the bill presented publicly and discussed in many different fora over the last 20 months, and including that this was presented to the Israeli embassy, and this was the only embassy with which it was kind of discussed. So Polish death camps phrase is so offensive to Poles, to the Polish people, and it is in itself also Holocaust denial, I would say, because Holocaust denial is not only about very wrong things being said about Holocaust, Jews, perpetrators, victims, but it is also about the real role of Poles, Germans, Jews, French, Russians, Americans, what they have not done in the United States, even after the report, very detailed report and very credible report presented by Jan Karski directly to Franklin Delano Roosevelt about the genocide, about the Holocaust happening on Polish soil to our Jewish brethren. And looking at this whole situation from this perspective, I have to also add that we don't want to say Jews lost so many people and Poles also so many people, because it is such a delicate issue that I only mention to you that there is no Polish family who has not lost their relatives during the Second World War. Ethnic Poles, there were maybe 22, 23, 24 million of those during the war, and 6 million Polish citizens lost their lives, were killed, predominantly by Germans, and some of them by the Soviets, by communists. So there is no Polish family which would not be which would not lose their relatives in Poland. Also, a very specific element of this tragedy which happened during the Second World War on the Polish soil was attack on Polish intelligentsia, on Polish people with higher education, but not only those, also policemen, doctors, lawyers, everybody who is so important for appropriate functioning of the whole society, of the whole state. The Germans in particular had a very well-organized so-called Intelligenzaktion, or in German it would be Intelligenzaktionen, in many Polish towns since the beginning of war. Actually, almost from the beginning of the war, because the first actions started in broad intelligence action started in October 1939. And both Germans and Soviets, they have actually tried to eliminate people with who have impact on or elites, you may say, professors, doctors, lawyers, politicians, people with higher education, to such an extent that there was only 2% of people with higher education in post-Second World War. So they have in Katyn, in many other places in Russia, but also in particular Germans, even more so. They have created such a target to eliminate this group of Polish population. And by the way, if you like to put it really in the context, it's when we Poles, we know what tragedy and genocide happened to our Jewish brothers and sisters, because it happened on the Polish territory, which had not belonged to Poland during the Second World War. But at the same time, we look at the French, the Danes, not to say the Germans, because we know what their role was, but the Dutch, the neutral Swedish population, Norway, and most of the governments and most of the states and nations have actually collaborated with Hitler and with Germans, like Quisling in Norway, or Tiso in Slovakia, or in Greece, or in Albania, or Vichy France with Pétain, and in Belgium and everywhere, actually. The only exception was Poland, or Ian Antonescu in Romania. The only exception was Poland. And our home army, which was the biggest underground army in the history of the world, was actually killing those very bad people, Poles, including, or many Poles, most of them Poles, but not only, also Germans and Ukrainians, Russians, who were killing or denouncing or murdering or participating in murdering our Jewish friends, Jewish communities, Jewish people. And this was all happening in the country where there was a death penalty for all of those, including their families who were helping Jews. So maybe a thesis I would put in front of you, which would sound to you a little bit provocative, but I truly believe that this is the case. Knowing the circumstances of war in Poland, in like general government, not in Poland, but knowing what the war looked like, I am of the view that you couldn't be rescued, you couldn't be saved on this soil without help of Polish family. So if there were 100 or 150,000 Jews saved during the Second World War, probably all of them, if not all of them, vast majority of them was saved thanks to whatever kind of help was delivered to them, was given to them by Polish population and some good Ukrainian population and Belarusian population, but probably 80% of this was Polish, 10% Belarusian, 10% Ukrainian. There were good people in those other countries too, but you couldn't be saved without help. It was impossible. The situation of Jews in German Nazi-occupied Europe, but in particular in German Nazi-occupied Poland, was so horrifying, was so terrible that it would not be possible. One different story, but probably not so much known in your great country, in Israel, is that many Jews were also saved through the Anders army. When the Third Reich attacked the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, short after this, there was a pact, Sikorski-Majski, and Poles were allowed to get out. The Poles who were first transported to Siberia and Kazakhstan and other parts of the Soviet Union, back then they were allowed to get out of Soviet Union, and they did so through Iran, today's Iran, Iraq, Palestine, North Africa, and then Italy, and they have been fighting in many other places. And Menahem Begin, Mieczysław Begin, was one of them who was part of this, who also was a young soldier in this army, and so were 15% of other Jewish population fighting hand in hand with their Polish friends against Germany in different fronts. And by the way, 18% of Polish army in 1939 was consisting of Jewish population. So this was so well rooted, interlinked with the Polish population that many of them were actually voluntarily part of the Polish army, which was defeated in September and October 1939. So this is in this context that we look at the bill, and when we read in Corriere della Sera or other Die Welt or other newspapers, Polish concentration camps, Polish death camps, we feel that this is something deeply inappropriate in those terms, in those notions, definitions, and we want to change that. It is not to deny that there were wrong people at our end. There were wrong people. There were people at our end, very bad people who did very wrong things. But if you think about the numbers, even Gunnar Paulsson, one Swedish, British, I think, historian, he says that in Nazi-occupied Warsaw, there were probably up to 90,000 people only in Warsaw who were helping Jews, and there were 2,000 to 3,000 or 3,000 to 4,000, around 3,000 Schmalzowniks, so people who were actually denouncing or killing, murdering Jews. And probably the population of Warsaw you can multiply to the entire territory of Poles, which would be similar equation which I would have presented to you a minute ago. But the whole bill, the whole legislation, not even one iota should forbid or make it more difficult to tell the truth about this very sad part of our joint history. And this is also very important for me to emphasize, because I know how delicate but also how difficult it is today for at least some part of Jewish population in Israel and maybe in other parts of the world to accept it. But people who know the circumstances, who lived here in Poland, including my aunts, one of them is in Herzliya in Israel, they understand it very, very well. They understand what was communism, they understand what was the occupation during the Second World War, and with a little bit of goodwill, I think it could be very well explained to everybody, including in Israel, so that all the doubts and reservations and complications and disappear, and the clarification of the intentions of our bill will prevail. So this is why I say something which is maybe again controversial for you, but I thank you for your friendship and for your understanding. So you will need to bear one more statement. I also believe that because of what has happened, the number of righteous amongst the nations, Polish righteous amongst the nations, if you compare them to the Dutch ones, with all the respect to everybody who has done anything to save Jews during the Second World War, it's completely uncomparable. It's completely uncomparable. If like in the Ulma's family or Kowalski or Skoczyla's family or Baranek family, the whole families with 8 children, everybody, families and neighbors were killed for helping Jews, it's even a more difficult moral dilemma than the question if I need to risk my life to save my friend, my neighbor, my brother, my sister. Well, I can decide about my life, but can I decide about the life of my wife, of my parents, of my children? Many families did, and in Markowa, many families did so even after the Black Dawn of 24th of March 1944, when the families were killed, but many other families still continued helping Jewish other families. So the provocative statement is that I hope it's provocative in inverted commas, because I truly believe it, that the whole Poland and the Poles should receive the righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, if you really immersed deeply into the history of the Second World War on the Polish soil, where 3 million Jews lost their lives, 3 million Polish Jews lost their lives here. By the way, post-war statistical data tell us that 3 million ethnic Poles also lost their lives. So there were 6 million altogether, Jewish and Polish. I see sometimes a figure 1.9 million or 2 millions. It's not 2 millions, it's 3 millions people. It's not that, I want to talk about statistics, but all data which are serious and prevail in, and where they were done in the post-communist Poland, so right after the war, indicate 5.8 million to 6.2 million of a total population loss, murdered, killed during the Second World War. So maybe that's it as for introduction.